I cleaned out my grandmother's house after she died, and I found a room I had never been in. Not a closet, a room. Behind a bookshelf in the basement, a door, unlocked. Inside, a wooden desk, a chair, and on the desk, a photograph of a man I had never seen, and a child. The child was my mother. The man was not my grandfather. My grandmother's name was Evelyn. She was 83 years old. She died in November, quietly, in her sleep, which was how she lived. She had lived in that house in Akron for 51 years, and she had kept this room the entire time, and nobody knew. I was the one who cleaned out the house. My mother is 60 years old and has bad knees, and my uncle lives in Phoenix. So it fell to me. The basement took longest. It always does. I worked through it toward the back wall, which was floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Old pine, paperbacks, the kind of nonfiction people bought in the 70s and never read. When I pulled the books from the third shelf from the left, the shelf moved. It swung slightly toward me. I felt a draft. I pulled it more deliberately. It was hinged on the right side. It opened like a door. Behind it was an actual door with a simple brass handle. I stood there looking at it for a long time. Then I turned the handle. The room was small, maybe 8 feet by 10. No window, a single lamp on the desk that still worked when I clicked it on, which meant my grandmother had been in this room recently enough that the bulb hadn't burned out. A wooden desk, a wooden chair, a small rug. On the desk, 2 dry pens in a glass, a coffee mug with a ring in the bottom, and a book lying open face down the way you leave a book when you intend to come back, and a photograph in a small silver frame. A man I had never seen, and my mother as a child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, in a summer dress, squinting into the sun. The man was maybe 30, with light hair. His hand was on my mother's shoulder. They were both smiling. The man was not my grandfather. I had known my grandfather until I was 14. I knew his face completely. This was not his face. I sat down on the floor of that small room, and I stayed there for a long time. I did not go through the desk drawers that day. I was not ready. I closed the lamp, and I went back through the hidden door, and I drove back to the house I was staying at, and I sat in the kitchen, and I called my mother. I said, "Mom, I need to ask you something about Grandma's house." She said, "Of course. What is it?" I said, "Did you know there was a room behind the bookshelf in the basement?" Silence. A very specific silence. Not the silence of someone confused. The silence of someone who has been waiting for a question without knowing when it would come. She said, "What did you find in it?" I said, "A photograph. A man I don't recognize, and you as a child." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "His name was Walter." I haven't heard that name out loud in 50 years. I drove back to the house the next morning with my mother on the phone. I went through the desk drawers while she listened. Inside the top drawer, letters, tied with kitchen twine, 2 bundles of them, the paper yellowed at the edges. The handwriting on the envelopes was my grandmother's. They were addressed to Walter Emery at an address in Cleveland. They had never been sent. In the second drawer, a journal, black cover, no label. My grandmother's handwriting inside, dated entries beginning in 1961 and ending in 1969. In the bottom drawer, a small box. Inside the box, wrapped in tissue paper, a ring. Not a wedding ring. Simpler than that, a narrow silver band with a small stone, and a note folded beneath it in my grandmother's handwriting. For when the time comes, it never did. Keep it anyway. My mother was 60 years old when she heard all of this over the phone. She was sitting in her kitchen in Columbus 4 hours away, and she was hearing about a room her mother had built in secret, and a man named Walter, and a ring that had never been given, and letters that had never been sent. She said she loved him before she married your grandfather. I knew that. She told me once when I was very young, maybe 8 or 9, she said, there was someone before your father, someone I had to let go of. And then she never mentioned it again. I thought it was just a thing people say, a story from before. I said, she kept a room, Mom. She built a hidden room, and she kept his letters and his photograph, and she kept it for 50 years. My mother was quiet. Then she said, she married your grandfather in 1963. She was 22 years old. I said she started the journal in 1961. I know what the dates mean. I think my mother knows too. 2 years of journal entries that end the year she married my grandfather. A hidden room that existed, quietly, behind a bookshelf for all the years of her marriage. Not a room of scheming or of ongoing deception. Walter's address was in Cleveland, and the letters were never sent, and there is no evidence she ever saw him again after 1963. Just a room of keeping, a private place for the part of herself she had to put away when she said yes to a different life. I read the journal over the course of a week, not to violate her privacy. She was gone, and I needed to understand. She wrote about Walter the way you write about something you are trying to memorize before it fades, specific and precise, full of the small details that tell you a person was real and present, and not just a feeling. The way he laughed, a specific argument they had that she replayed and examined from every angle. The day she understood that it was not going to work, which she described not as a dramatic ending, but as a slow understanding, a door closing so gradually you almost don't notice until it is shut. She wrote, I am going to love him my whole life and not see him again. And that is the shape of things, and I am going to learn to live in that shape. She wrote that in 1962. She lived in that shape for 50 years. She built herself a room for it. I kept the photograph. I kept the ring, which my grandmother had written, keep it anyway. I kept the journal, not to share, just to have, just to know the full person she was before she was anyone's grandmother. My grandfather was a good man. He and my grandmother had 40 years together and 2 children and a life that was full in the ways lives can be full when 2 decent people decide to build something. I don't think she was unhappy. I think she was a person who loved completely twice and lost one of those loves and found a way to carry both. Some people put things down when they become too heavy. My grandmother built a room. She kept the lamp plugged in. She left the book open like she was coming back. She never told anyone. I know now. My mother drove to Akron the following weekend. I had asked her if she wanted to see the room, and she had been quiet for a long time on the phone, and then she said, yes, I think I need to. She arrived on a Saturday morning. We had coffee at the kitchen table first, which felt necessary, a buffer of ordinary before the extraordinary. She had driven 4 hours alone, which she had not told me she was going to do until she was already halfway there. She said it was easier that way, to just be in the car and moving, rather than thinking about it too long. I took her downstairs. I showed her the shelf, the way it opened, the door behind it. She stood in front of it for a moment before she reached out and touched the frame of the hidden door with her fingertips. She said, I never knew this was here. I said, neither did I. We went in together. I had left the lamp on since my first visit. It felt wrong to turn it off, like extinguishing something that was supposed to stay lit. My mother stood in the small room and looked at the desk, at the photograph still in its frame, at the open book on the desk, whose spine I still hadn't examined. She picked up the photograph. She looked at it for a very long time. She said, I remember this day. We were at a picnic, a church thing. I must have been 7. He was always at those events. He was in the congregation. He and your grandmother were. She paused. She said, they were close. I knew they were close the way children know things without understanding them. There was a particular way they were in the same room. She set the photograph down carefully. I showed her the letters, the bundles tied with kitchen twine, all addressed to Walter Emery in Cleveland. None of them sent. She held one of the bundles without untying it. She said, she wrote to him and never sent them. I said, for years. The postmarks would have been, I don't know. She dated the journal, but not the letters. My mother set the bundle down. She looked at the journal on the desk, which I had replaced after reading it. She said, did you read it? I said, yes. She said, should I? I thought about that. I said, I think that's your choice. I can tell you what's in it if you'd rather. She thought for a moment. Then she said, tell me. I told her everything that was in it. Not word for word. Some of it was too private even for this. Even in this room with the lamp on and the two of us and the weight of what my grandmother had kept here. But the shape of it, the before, Walter, the decision, the line I had memorized because it had not left me since I read it. I am going to love him my whole life and not see him again. And that is the shape of things, and I am going to learn to live in that shape. My mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said she was happy. I want you to know that. She and your grandfather. It was a good marriage. It was not a tragic marriage, not a loveless one. I grew up in a house with 2 people who chose each other every day. I said, I know. She said, but she also kept this. I said, both can be true. She looked around the small room, at the desk and the chair and the rug on the concrete floor, at the lamp she had kept plugged in, at the book still lying open. She said, what book is it? I hadn't looked. I picked it up. It was a novel. Not one I recognized, a paperback from the 1970s with a broken spine and a cover faded to near illegibility. I found the page it was open to, and I read the first line my eye landed on. She had learned that love does not end simply because the people involved in it do. My mother looked at that line for a long time. She said she was reading that when she died. I said, I think so. She said she wanted to finish it. We stood in that small room for a long time. Eventually we went upstairs, and I made lunch, and we sat at the kitchen table, and we talked about my grandmother the way you talk about someone once you have seen the room behind the bookshelf. More fully, more honestly, with the specific tenderness of knowing a person better than you did before, even though they are no longer there to know. I kept the room exactly as it was for 3 weeks before I finally packed it. I took the photograph and the ring and the journal, and I left the rest for the estate sale people, who would find a plain room with a desk and a chair and a lamp and an empty shelf and would not know what had happened there. That felt right. The things that mattered had already been carried out. The ring is in a small wooden box on my dresser. I look at it sometimes. A narrow silver band with a small stone, tissue paper still faint from 50 years of storage. For when the time comes, my grandmother wrote, it never did. Keep it anyway. I am keeping it. She loved someone completely and let him go and built herself a room for the part of herself she couldn't take out into the open. She kept the lamp plugged in for 50 years. That is the whole of it. She left the book open like she was coming back. Maybe she believed she would. Maybe that is enough.